March 17, 1945, somewhere near the Elbe River, Germany, Captain James Mitchell stood beside his M4 Sherman tank, watching a group of Romanian prisoners of war huddled around a makeshift fire pit in the cold morning air. The men had surrendered 3 days earlier, exhausted remnants of a unit that had switched sides too late to matter much in the grand scheme of the war. They were cooking something in a battered pot, and the smell of chicory and burnt grain drifted across the muddy field where American armor had gathered for resupply. One of the Romanians, a thin sergeant with hollow cheeks and a threadbare uniform, caught sight of Mitchell pouring himself a cup from the company's coffee urn. The man laughed, said something in Romanian to his companions, and they all joined in the mockery. Mitchell didn't speak Romanian, but he understood the universal language of contempt. They were laughing at American coffee. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mitchell had heard it before. European soldiers, even enemy ones, seemed to take particular pride in mocking the thin, watery brew that the U.S. Army issued to its troops. The standard coffee ration was a pre-ground mixture that had often sat in warehouses for months before reaching the front lines. By the time it made its way through the supply chain, across the Atlantic, through depot after depot, and finally into the hands of soldiers in the field, whatever flavor it once possessed had long since departed. The result was a pale brown liquid that tasted vaguely of coffee in the same way that powdered eggs tasted vaguely of eggs. It was hot, it contained caffeine, and that was about all anyone could say in its favor. The Romanian sergeant stood up and walked closer to the American line, emboldened by hunger and the strange camaraderie that sometimes develops between captors and captives when the fighting has stopped. He gestured at Mitchell's cup and made an exaggerated face of disgust, then pointed back at the pot his companions were tending. He said something that Mitchell's translator, a private named Eddie Kowalski who had picked up enough Romanian from his grandmother, loosely interpreted as "Your American coffee is like drinking dirty river water, but what we make is real coffee, the kind that puts hair on your chest and fire in your belly." Mitchell smiled and nodded, raising his cup in mock salute. He had no interest in arguing about coffee with a prisoner of war. There were more important things to worry about. The company had been pushing east for weeks, and everyone was exhausted. Men slept in their tanks when they could, grabbed meals whenever supply trucks caught up with them, and drank whatever passed for coffee because it was hot and helped keep them awake. The quality of the beverage ranked somewhere below ammunition supply and above latrine duty on the list of things that mattered. But the incident stuck with Mitchell, not because it offended him, but because it reminded him of something he had witnessed 2 months earlier that had changed his understanding of what American soldiers were actually drinking when they climbed into their tanks. The memory came back to him as he watched the Romanian prisoners carefully measure out their precious coffee grounds, treating the ritual with the kind of reverence that men reserve for things that connect them to home and normalcy in the middle of chaos. What the Romanian sergeant didn't know, what almost nobody outside of American armored units knew, was that the coffee Mitchell and his fellow officers drank from the company urn was not the same coffee that tank crews drank inside their vehicles. There was standard army coffee, and then there was tank coffee, and the difference between them was profound enough that it had become something of a secret among the men who fought in armored vehicles. Mitchell had learned about it by accident, and the knowledge had shifted his perspective on the massive industrial effort that kept American forces supplied with not just weapons and ammunition, but with the small comforts that made impossible conditions slightly more bearable. The story of what tank crews actually drank, and why it mattered more than anyone realized, began not with coffee at all, but with a problem that had plagued armored warfare since tanks first appeared on battlefields in World War I. The problem was simple to describe and maddeningly difficult to solve. How do you keep men functioning at peak performance when they are sealed inside a steel box for hours or days at a time, subjected to noise, heat, cold fumes, and the constant stress of combat, with no ability to step outside for fresh air or a moment of normalcy? December 1941, Fort Knox, Kentucky. The United States had just entered World War II, and the Army's armored force was expanding at a pace that strained every aspect of training and logistics. Major General Jacob Devers, commanding the armored force, had received reports from British tank crews fighting in North Africa that painted a disturbing picture of conditions inside armored vehicles during extended operations. The British had been fighting Germany's Afrika Korps for over a year, and their after-action reports documented problems that went far beyond mechanical reliability or armor thickness. Tank crews were suffering from dehydration, heat exhaustion, and a condition that British medical officers called operational fatigue, but that everyone else simply called breaking down. Men would emerge from their tanks after 12 or 14 hours of operation, unable to walk straight, unable to focus their eyes, sometimes unable to remember basic procedures they had drilled hundreds of times. Some of this was attributable to combat stress, but medical examinations revealed something else. Tank crews were consistently showing signs of severe dehydration and caffeine withdrawal even when they had access to water and standard coffee rations. The problem was the environment inside a tank. Summer temperatures in North Africa could reach 110 degrees Fahrenheit outside, which meant temperatures inside a steel tank could exceed 140 degrees. The engine compartment, separated from the crew by only thin armor plate, radiated heat that turned the interior into an oven. Crews sweated constantly, losing fluid at rates that made it difficult to stay hydrated even when water was available. But water alone wasn't enough. The human body needs electrolytes, and it needs stimulants to maintain alertness during the kind of extended operations that armored warfare demanded. British tank crews had developed an unofficial solution. They brewed tea using portable spirit stoves inside their tanks, adding sugar and condensed milk to create a thick, sweet beverage that provided fluid, calories and caffeine in a form that could be consumed quickly between engagements. The tea break became so integral to British tank operations that vehicles were eventually equipped with boiling vessels, small electric kettles that could heat water using the tank's electrical system. The British vehicular boiler, introduced in 1944, became standard equipment in British armored vehicles, and remained so for decades. American tank crews couldn't adopt the British solution because American soldiers, by and large, didn't drink tea. Coffee was the American beverage, culturally embedded to a degree that made substitution impossible. But standard Army coffee presented problems inside a tank. The pre-ground coffee issued in rations required boiling water and time to brew properly. Tank crews operating under combat conditions couldn't spare the time or the attention required to brew coffee using field methods. They needed something that could be prepared quickly, consumed quickly, and would provide sustained energy and alertness. January 1942, the Quartermaster Research and Development Laboratories, Chicago, Illinois, Colonel Thomas Hanley received an assignment from the War Department to investigate methods of improving rations for armored vehicle crews. Hanley was a career logistics officer who had spent the years between the wars studying how industrial efficiency principles could be applied to military supply chains. He understood that modern warfare was as much about logistics as it was about tactics, and that small improvements in how soldiers were fed and supplied could have outsized effects on combat effectiveness. Hanley assembled a team that included nutritionists, chemists, food scientists, and combat veterans who had experience with armored operations. Their initial research focused on caloric requirements and meal timing, but conversations with tank crews quickly revealed that the most pressing issue wasn't food. It was coffee. Crews wanted coffee that could be prepared inside a tank, using minimal equipment, that would stay hot for hours, and that would provide reliable stimulation, without the crashes that came from drinking too much too fast or too little too slowly. The standard Army coffee ration couldn't meet these requirements. It was designed for preparation in large batches using company-level equipment, then distributed to individual soldiers. The assumption was that coffee would be brewed at field kitchens and consumed during meal breaks. But tank crews didn't have meal breaks in any conventional sense. They ate when they could, often while the tank was moving, and they needed coffee available continuously throughout operations that could last 18 or 20 hours. The solution required thinking what coffee could be. Standard coffee was a beverage prepared by percolating hot water through ground beans.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The process extracted caffeine, oils, and flavor compounds, producing a drink that had to be consumed relatively soon after brewing or it would become bitter and unpalatable. Inside a tank, where space was limited, equipment had to be simple and attention had to remain focused on operations. This process was impractical. What tank crews needed was coffee that could be prepared in advance, stored in insulated containers, and consumed throughout a long day without degrading in quality. They needed coffee that would maintain its temperature and its effectiveness as a stimulant even after sitting for hours. Most importantly, they needed coffee that tasted good enough that crews would actually drink it, because the best solution in the world was worthless if soldiers refused to consume it. Hanley's team began experimenting with different preparation methods and additives. They quickly discovered that the problem wasn't the coffee itself, but how it was prepared and what else was mixed with it. Coffee brewed with standard methods and allowed to sit would oxidize, developing harsh, bitter flavors that made it undrinkable. But coffee brewed stronger with particular attention to water temperature and brewing time, then mixed with ingredients that stabilized the flavor compounds, could remain palatable for extended periods. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of the food scientists on Hanley's team, a civilian chemist named Robert Chen who had worked for a commercial coffee company before the war, suggested looking at how cowboy coffee had been prepared on the American frontier. Cowboys working cattle drives in the 19th century had faced similar challenges to modern tank crews. They needed coffee that could be prepared over campfires, kept hot for hours, and consumed throughout long days of hard physical labor. Cowboy coffee was made by boiling coffee grounds directly in water, then adding a small amount of cold water or crushed eggshell to settle the grounds. The result was a strong, thick brew that could sit over a low fire for hours without becoming bitter. The key was the boiling process, which extracted caffeine and flavor compounds quickly, and the settling agent which prevented over-extraction that caused bitterness. Chen proposed adapting this method for tank crews using modern materials and precise formulations. Instead of boiling grounds in water, crews would use a specially prepared concentrate mixed with hot water from their tank's cooling system. The concentrate would be shelf-stable, require no brewing equipment, and produce consistent results regardless of who prepared or under what conditions. The idea of using engine cooling water raised immediate concerns. Tank engines ran hot and the cooling systems used water glycol mixtures that were definitely not safe for human consumption. But American tanks had secondary cooling systems that used pure water for auxiliary functions, and with minor modifications these systems could provide clean hot water for crew use. British tanks had already demonstrated the concept with their boiling vessels. American engineers could adapt the same principle. February 1942, Hanley's team began testing coffee concentrates. The technical challenges were substantial. The concentrate had to be stable for months in tropical heat and Arctic cold. It had to mix readily with hot water without requiring stirring equipment. It had to produce coffee that tasted good enough that tired, stressed soldiers would drink it in preference to other available options. And it had to be manufacturable at scale, because if the solution worked, the army would need millions of units. Commercial coffee companies were contracted to develop formulations. Hills Brothers, Maxwell House, and Folgers each submitted samples based on their proprietary roasting and extraction processes. The samples were tested by focus groups consisting of tank crews from training units at Fort Knox. The results were mixed. Some concentrates produced coffee that tasted fine when fresh but became unpalatable after sitting in insulated containers for 6 hours. Others maintained flavor but provided inconsistent caffeine delivery, with some batches producing jittery overstimulation while others barely register. The problem was variation in the coffee beans themselves. Coffee is an agricultural product, and like all agricultural products, it varies based on growing conditions, harvest timing, and processing methods. Commercial roasters manage this variation by blending beans from multiple sources to achieve consistent flavor profiles. But wartime disrupted supply chains, making it impossible to guarantee that any particular blend would be available consistently. Chen proposed a radical solution. Instead of trying to manage variation through blending, eliminate variation through chemistry. Extract pure caffeine from coffee beans, isolate and stabilize the flavor compounds separately, then recombine them in precise ratios that could be maintained regardless of bean source. The result would be less a coffee concentrate and more a coffee analog, a beverage that delivered the experience and effects of coffee through engineered means rather than traditional brewing. The proposal generated fierce debate. Coffee purists argued that artificial coffee was an abomination, a betrayal of the beverage's cultural significance. But Hanley understood that his job wasn't to please coffee snobs, it was to keep tank crews alert and operational during extended combat. If engineered coffee did that better than traditional coffee, then engineered coffee was the right solution. March 1942, a small facility in Hoboken, New Jersey began producing experimental batches of what internal documents referred to as armored vehicle hot beverage concentrate. The name was deliberately bland to avoid controversy. The product itself was anything but bland. Each batch combined pharmaceutical-grade caffeine, extracted coffee oils, stabilized flavor compounds, and a carefully balanced mixture of sugars and salts designed to promote hydration and provide quick energy. The concentrate came in small metal tins, each containing enough powder to produce 1 gallon of finished beverage when mixed with hot water. Instructions printed on the tin were simple: add contents to hot water, stir briefly, serve. No brewing equipment required, no waiting for percolation, no timing or temperature management needed. A tank crew could prepare a full day's coffee supply in less than 5 minutes. Initial field trials at Fort Knox produced promising results. Tank crews reported that the beverage tasted better than standard Army coffee, maintained flavor and temperature throughout extended operations, and provided steady energy without crashes or jitters. Crews also noticed that they felt less dehydrated and less fatigued at the end of long training exercises compared to days when they drank standard coffee or no coffee at all. The secret was the electrolyte balance. Chen had formulated the concentrate to include sodium and potassium in ratios that promoted fluid retention without causing the bloating or nausea that could come from drinking plain water or standard coffee in high-heat environments. Tank crews were essentially drinking a primitive form of what would later be called a sports drink, decades before such products became commercially available. But the real validation came not from controlled trials but from combat reports. Summer 1942, American M3 Grant tanks arrived in North Africa to support British operations against Rommel's forces. A small number of tanks were equipped with experimental hot water systems and issued the new coffee concentrate as part of a quiet trial program. Crews were told only that they were testing new rations, not that the coffee was anything special. After-action reports from these crews showed measurably better performance than crews using standard rations. Crews with the new coffee maintained alertness longer, required fewer breaks, and reported feeling less exhausted after extended operations. When the trial was expanded and crews were asked directly about the coffee, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Soldiers who had complained bitterly about standard Army coffee praised the new beverage. Some crews reported that they actually looked forward to long operations because it meant they could drink the good coffee. The trial results convinced the War Department to authorize mass production. By autumn 1942, contracts were issued to multiple manufacturers to produce armored vehicle hot beverage concentrate at rates sufficient to supply every American tank crew in every theater. The product was classified as confidential not because it contained military secrets but because the Army didn't want enemy intelligence learning that American tank crews had access to a performance-enhancing ration that Axis forces lacked. October 1942, the first large-scale shipments reached units training for the invasion of North Africa. Tank commanders received the concentrate along with installation kits for hot water systems in their vehicles. The systems were simple: a small heat exchanger that tapped waste heat from the engine, a purified water reservoir and a spigot that delivered hot water on demand. Total installation time was under 2 hours and maintenance requirements were minimal. The coffee concentrate became standard issue for American armored units throughout 1943 and 1944. Crews developed elaborate preparation rituals, with each tank establishing its own preferred ratio of concentrate to water, its own favored additives, and its own schedule for brewing and consumption. Some crews liked their coffee strong enough that it was almost syrupy, others preferred lighter preparations. The concentrate was forgiving enough to accommodate personal preference while still delivering consistent performance. What made the system revolutionary wasn't just the coffee itself but how it changed crew behavior. Before the concentrate, tank crews had to choose between staying buttoned up inside their vehicles and going outside to brew coffee using portable stoves or field kitchens. Staying inside meant doing without coffee for hours. Going outside meant exposure to enemy fire and loss of operational readiness. The hot water system and concentrate eliminated this dilemma. Crews could prepare fresh coffee inside their tanks in minutes without exposing themselves to danger or taking the tank out of action. The operational impact was significant enough that Soviet tank crews, after encountering American units during the link-up at the Elbe, specifically asked about the American coffee system. Soviet tankers had been drinking tea or vodka during operations, neither of which provided the sustained energy and hydration that the American system delivered. The Soviets requested technical specifications, and after the war, they developed their own version using tea concentrate instead of coffee. But in March 1945, standing in that muddy field near the Elbe, watching Romanian prisoners mock American coffee, Captain Mitchell was one of the few people outside of armored units who understood the full story. He had learned about it in January, during a resupply operation when a tank crew had invited him to share their coffee. Mitchell had expected the same thin bitter fluid he drank from the company urn. What he tasted instead was rich, smooth, and energizing in a way that standard Army coffee never managed. The tank commander, a staff sergeant named William Torres from San Antonio, had explained the whole system while they sat in the tank's cramped interior, drinking coffee and waiting for orders. Torres treated the coffee with reverence, carefully measuring the concentrate, adjusting the water temperature, timing the mixing process with the attention that some men gave to cleaning their weapons. "This isn't just coffee," Torres had explained. "This is what keeps us alive in here. When you're buttoned up for 12 hours, running hot, breathing fumes, listening to shells bounce off the armor, this is the thing that keeps your hand steady and your mind sharp. The guys who designed this, they understood what we needed better than we understood it ourselves." Mitchell had asked why the concentrate wasn't issued to regular infantry or other units if it was so effective. Torres had shrugged. He didn't know the official reason, but he suspected it was a combination of cost, supply limitations, and the simple fact that tank crews needed it more. Infantry could brew coffee at company kitchens and carry it in canteens. Tank crews couldn't. They needed a system that worked inside a sealed vehicle, and that system was too expensive and complicated to deploy Army-wide when simpler solutions worked adequately for other units. Now, watching the Romanian sergeant gesture animatedly about the superiority of European coffee, Mitchell felt a strange mix of amusement and respect. The sergeant was right that standard American coffee was mediocre at best, but he had no idea that 50 yards away, inside those Sherman tanks that probably looked crude and utilitarian to European eyes, American crews were drinking coffee that represented the cutting edge of military nutrition science. Coffee that was designed, engineered, and optimized to keep men functioning at peak efficiency during the most demanding operations imaginable. Mitchell walked over to the Romanian prisoners. Through Kowalski, he asked if any of them had ever fought against American armor. The sergeant nodded. "In Romania, before we switched sides, we faced American tanks near Bucharest. They never stopped. Day and night they kept moving, kept fighting. We thought maybe they had special pills, something to keep them awake. Our own tank crews, after 8 or 10 hours they were finished, had to rest. But the Americans just kept." "Would you like to know the secret?" Mitchell asked. The sergeant looked skeptical but curious. Mitchell gestured toward the tanks. "It wasn't pills, it was coffee. Special coffee made specifically for tank crews. Coffee that gives them energy and keeps them alert for as long as they need to fight." The sergeant laughed, clearly thinking Mitchell was joking or exaggerating. But Mitchell was serious. "Sometimes," he said, "the difference between winning and losing isn't about who has the bigger guns or thicker armor. Sometimes it's about who figured out how to keep their soldiers awake and focused when everyone else is falling apart from exhaustion." The sergeant's expression changed as he realized Mitchell wasn't joking. He looked at the tanks with new understanding, seeing them not just as weapons but as complete systems designed to keep crews operational under conditions that would break men in ordinary vehicles. The coffee was just one piece, but it was a piece that mattered more than anyone outside the system would guess. That evening, after the prisoners had been moved to a rear area camp and the tank company had settled into a defensive position for the night, Mitchell sat with Torres and several other tank commanders around a small fire. Someone had brought out a tin of the concentrate and they brewed a pot using water heated over the fire rather than from a tank system. The ritual was familiar to all of them: measure the concentrate, heat the water to just below boiling, mix thoroughly, let it sit for a minute to settle, then pour. Torres passed Mitchell a cup. "This is the real stuff," he said. "Not that dishwater they serve at the mess." Mitchell took a sip and tasted what had kept American tank crews functioning through the deserts of North Africa, the hedgerows of France, and the winter hell of the Battle of the Bulge. It wasn't just the flavor, though that was better than any Army coffee he had tasted. It was knowing what the beverage represented: the industrial capacity to manufacture millions of tins of specialized concentrate, the scientific knowledge to formulate a drink that optimized human performance, the logistical sophistication to deliver that drink to tank crews scattered across 3 continents, and the institutional understanding that small advantages in crew performance could translate to decisive advantages in battle. The Romanian prisoners had mocked American coffee, and they had been right to mock the standard issue, but they had no idea what American tank crews were actually drinking, and that ignorance wasn't their fault. It was by design. The concentrate was never publicized, never celebrated, never turned into propaganda. It was just another piece of the vast machinery that kept American forces supplied and operational, invisible to outsiders but invaluable to the men who depended on it. Mitchell thought about all the other small innovations that probably existed throughout the army, unknown to anyone except the people who used them. Special rations for paratroopers, modified equipment for Arctic operations, adapted uniforms for jungle warfare. Each one representing someone's careful thought about what soldiers needed and how to provide it. The cumulative effect of hundreds or thousands of these small improvements was difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. American forces weren't just better equipped in terms of weapons and vehicles, they were better supported in every aspect of operation, down to the coffee they drank while fighting. The fire burned low, and the tank commanders finished their coffee and dispersed to their vehicles for the night. Mitchell returned to his own bivouac, his mind still turning over the implications of what he had learned. The war would end soon, that much was clear. Germany was collapsing, and Japan couldn't hold out much longer. When peace came, most of the specialized wartime innovations would be forgotten or classified. The proximity fuse, the Norden bomb sight, the radar systems, those might become famous eventually, but the coffee concentrate would probably fade into obscurity, known only to the men who had relied on it, and the few civilians who had worked on its development. That seemed appropriate somehow. The concentrate had never been about glory or recognition, it had been about solving a specific problem, keeping tank crews alert and operational during extended combat. The solution worked, and that was enough. No monuments would be built to commemorate the coffee that helped win the war, but then again, the men who had drunk it didn't need monuments. They had something better, the memory of sitting in a tank's crew compartment, hands wrapped around a warm cup, feeling the caffeine and sugar and electrolytes doing their work, knowing that someone far away had cared enough to figure out exactly what they needed and how to deliver it. Mitchell fell asleep that night, thinking about the Romanian sergeant's expression when he realized that American tanks carried systems designed to keep crews functioning at peak efficiency. That look of dawning comprehension, the sudden understanding that American military power wasn't just about industrial output or technological innovation in weapons, it was about systematic attention to every aspect of operations, including the mundane question of what soldiers drank while fighting. Wars were won by men who stayed alert when the enemy was exhausted, who maintained focus when others were breaking down, who had the energy to push forward one more hour, one more day, one more week. Coffee wouldn't win battles by itself, but coffee that was formulated to optimize performance, delivered reliably to the men who needed it, integrated into vehicle systems that made it accessible during combat, that coffee was a force multiplier that enemy commanders never anticipated and couldn't easily counter. The story of tank coffee never made headlines, it didn't inspire dramatic war correspondent dispatches or feature in post-war memoirs. The men who developed it returned to civilian life, and rarely spoke about their wartime work. The chemists and nutritionists went back to food companies and research laboratories. The quartermaster officers who had managed production and distribution moved on to other assignments. The institutional knowledge was preserved in classified reports and technical manuals that gathered dust in archives. But for a generation of American tank crews, the memory remained vivid. The distinctive metal tins with their simple instructions, the ritual of preparation inside a cramped steel box while shells burst outside, the taste of coffee that was somehow better than any they had drunk before or would drink again, the way it cut through exhaustion and steadied nerves and made it possible to keep fighting when every instinct screamed to stop. Those memories stayed with them for the rest of their lives, private knowledge of a small but significant advantage that had helped them survive when survival was never guaranteed. Captain Mitchell never forgot that evening by the Elbe, never forgot the Romanian sergeant's disbelief when told that American superiority extended even to coffee. The sergeant had learned a lesson that Mitchell himself was still processing, that modern warfare was fought not just with weapons but with systems that supported the men who used those weapons. The side that understood this principle and implemented it systematically had advantages that were invisible until they became decisive. Tank coffee was one system among thousands, but it exemplified the approach that had made American forces so formidable. Identify a problem, apply scientific method to finding a solution, engineer a product that solved the problem reliably, manufacture it at scale, distribute it efficiently, and integrate it seamlessly into operations. Repeat this process for every aspect of military life, from ammunition to boots to food to coffee, and the cumulative result was forces that could sustain operations longer, fight more effectively, and prevail in situations where opponents with equivalent weapons would fail. The Romanian prisoners eventually learned what American tank crews drank, though not through any official disclosure. After the war, some of them immigrated to the United States and met veterans who had served in armored units. The veterans would sometimes mention the special coffee, usually in passing, as one detail among many in stories about their service. The former prisoners would remember their own mockery of American coffee and realize how completely they had misunderstood what they were seeing. They had judged based on the standard issue beverage served at field kitchens, never imagining that elite units had access to something entirely different. The misunderstanding was natural and completely comprehensible, but it symbolized a larger failure of imagination about American military capability. Decades later, when historians began writing comprehensive accounts of World War II logistics, a few discovered references to armored vehicle hot beverage concentrate in declassified quartermaster records. Most ignored it as a trivial detail, focusing instead on the movement of ammunition, fuel, and major rations. But a handful recognized that the concentrate represented something significant about how America had approached the war. The attention to detail, the willingness to invest in solutions to problems that seemed minor but had major operational impact, the integration of science and industry and military necessity, all of this was embodied in something as simple as coffee, made specifically for tank crews. The concentrate itself disappeared after the war. Military attention shifted to new technologies like freeze-dried foods and instant coffee that could be used by all troops, eliminating the need for specialized beverages for particular units. The hot water systems in tanks were removed during post-war refits, replaced by more modern crew comfort features. The manufacturing facilities that had produced millions of tins of concentrate were converted to civilian production. The formulation remained classified for years, though not because it contained anything particularly secret. It was classified simply because that's what happened to most wartime innovations, unless there was a specific reason to declassify them. In the 1960s, when the U.S. Army began developing rations for astronauts, working with NASA, researchers discovered the old quartermaster reports on tank coffee concentrate. The concept of an engineered beverage that provided fluid, energy, and electrolytes, in a form optimized for extreme conditions, turned out to be directly applicable to spaceflight. Some of the same principles that Chen and Hanley had worked out in 1942 were incorporated into the Tang-based drink mixes that astronauts consumed during Gemini and Apollo missions. The connection was never publicized, but it existed, another thread linking World War II innovation to Cold War technological achievement. Captain Mitchell served out the war and returned to civilian life in Pennsylvania, where he worked as an engineer for a steel company. He married, raised children, and lived a quiet life that bore little resemblance to his wartime service. He rarely spoke about his experiences, and when he did, he focused on the larger events: the battles, the friends lost, the relief of coming home. He never mentioned tank coffee to anyone outside his old unit. But once a year, on the anniversary of VE Day, Mitchell would go to a specialty coffee shop and order the strongest, darkest brew they made. He would add sugar and a pinch of salt, mixing it carefully, and he would sit alone and drink it slowly. The taste was never quite right. Commercial coffee, even good commercial coffee, lacked the precise formulation that had made tank coffee special, but the ritual mattered more than the accuracy. It was his private way of remembering not just the war but the countless invisible efforts that had supported men in combat, the chemists and engineers who had figured out what tank crews needed, the factory workers who had manufactured millions of tins, the supply sergeants who had ensured delivery to the front lines, the quartermasters who had managed the entire system. All of them had contributed to victory in ways that would never be recognized publicly but that had been absolutely essential. Staff Sergeant Torres, the tank commander who had first shared the special coffee with Mitchell, also survived the war. He returned to San Antonio and opened a small restaurant that served Mexican food and incongruously excellent coffee. Torres never explained to customers why he was so particular about his coffee or why he insisted on using a specific preparation method that seemed needlessly complex. People just knew that Torres made the best coffee in San Antonio, strong and smooth and somehow energizing in a way that other coffee wasn't. A few regular customers, veterans who recognized the taste, understood. They never said anything, just nodded to Torres when he served them, a silent acknowledgement of shared knowledge. The Romanian sergeant whose mockery had sparked Mitchell's memories never learned the full story. He survived the war, returned to Romania, and lived through decades of communist rule. He sometimes told stories about his time as a prisoner of war, emphasizing the generosity of American guards and the abundance of American supplies. He would mention that American coffee was terrible, a detail that always got laughs. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the fall of communism, that he met an American veteran at a reunion event in Bucharest. The veteran had served in armored units, and when the Romanian mentioned American coffee, the veteran smiled and asked which coffee he meant. The standard issue, or the tank crew coffee. The Romanian sergeant felt the same confusion he had experienced 50 years earlier. What tank crew coffee? The veteran explained, briefly and without much detail, that American tank crews had drunk a special coffee that was engineered for their specific needs. The Romanian sergeant, now an old man, sat quietly for a moment, processing this information. Then he laughed, not with mockery but with genuine appreciation. "You Americans," he said. "You thought of everything, even coffee." The veteran nodded. "Especially coffee," he replied, "because if the crew can't stay alert, nothing else matters." That conversation, late in both men's lives, captured something essential about the story of tank coffee. It wasn't about the beverage itself. It was about the mindset that had created it. The understanding that military effectiveness depended on thousands of details, each one seemingly minor, collectively decisive. The willingness to invest in solutions to problems that other militaries might ignore or accept as unavoidable. The institutional capacity to translate scientific knowledge into practical products and deliver them at scale. And perhaps most importantly, the respect for soldiers implied by the effort to give them exactly what they needed, even when what they needed was something as simple and easily overlooked as good coffee. The war ended 3 months later. Mitchell returned home carrying memories that would never fade. Every Memorial Day, he visited Torres in San Antonio and they shared coffee prepared the old way. Neither man spoke much during these visits. The ritual said everything that needed saying. They had survived because someone cared enough to solve problems most people never knew existed. Torres died in 1987. At his funeral, Mitchell met dozens of former tank crew members who had traveled from across the country. They gathered at Torres's restaurant afterward, and someone found an old tin of the concentrate in a storage room. Nobody knew how Torres had kept it all those years. They brewed one final pot together, measuring carefully, heating the water to exactly the right temperature, mixing with the precision of men performing a sacred ceremony. The coffee tasted like memory, like diesel fumes and cordite and fear transformed into something drinkable, like the moment when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm and then suddenly didn't, like the knowledge that somewhere, people you would never meet had worked to give you exactly what you needed to survive another day. Mitchell raised his cup in silent tribute to Torres, to every tank crew that had relied on that concentrate, to the chemists and engineers who had created it. Years later, Mitchell's grandson asked him what winning the war had really required. Mitchell thought about grand strategy and industrial capacity and brave men making impossible sacrifices. But he also thought about coffee designed specifically for tank crews. "Sometimes victory comes from taking care of the smallest details," he said. "Sometimes it comes from understanding that soldiers need more than weapons. They need someone back home figuring out how to keep them alert when alertness means the difference between life and death." The grandson didn't fully understand, and Mitchell didn't expect him to. Some knowledge can only be earned through experience. The taste of engineered coffee in a steel box while the world exploded outside. The gratitude for invisible people solving invisible problems. The recognition that wars are won by nations that care about their soldiers enough to optimize everything, even beverages, most people would consider unimportant. Mitchell died in 2003, taking his memories with him. His grandson inherited a small metal tin that Mitchell had kept in his desk drawer for 60 years. The tin was empty, its label faded but still readable. Armored vehicle hot beverage concentrate. Instructions for preparation, a manufacture date from 1944. The grandson kept it on his own desk, a reminder that his grandfather had fought in a war where even coffee was a weapon. The Romanian sergeant died in 1998, never having tasted the real American tank coffee, but he had learned the lesson that day near the Elbe. American power wasn't just about having more tanks or better tactics, it was about systematic excellence in every detail, visible and invisible. That realization had shaped his understanding of why some nations prevailed while others failed. Victory belonged to those who refused to accept that any problem was too small to solve. The concentrate itself became a footnote in military history, mentioned briefly in technical manuals and logistic studies. Most historians overlooked it entirely, focused on battles and generals and dramatic turning points. But the men who had drunk it never forgot. In veterans' hospitals and retirement homes, old tankers would sometimes mention the special coffee, and other old tankers would nod in recognition. They shared a secret that had once helped keep them alive. In the end, the story of tank coffee wasn't about coffee at all. It was about a nation that mobilized its scientific talent, industrial capacity, and institutional knowledge to support soldiers in ways both large and small. It was about understanding that human performance determined outcomes, and that optimizing that performance required attention to needs most people never considered. It was about respect for the men who fought, expressed through the effort to give them tools that worked and supplies that sustained them. The tin that Mitchell's grandson inherited sits in a museum now, donated after he realized its historical significance. Visitors walk past it without much notice, attracted instead to tanks and uniforms and weapons, but occasionally someone stops and reads the label carefully. They think about what it represented. They imagine tired men in steel boxes, drinking coffee that someone had engineered specifically for them. They understand, perhaps for the first time, that winning required more than courage and firepower. It required a human society that cared enough to solve every problem, no matter how mundane it seemed. That care, multiplied across thousands of innovations and millions of soldiers, had made all the difference. The proximity fuse got the headlines. The atomic bomb ended the war, but in between those dramatic technologies were countless smaller innovations that kept men functioning day after day. Tank coffee was one. There were hundreds of others, most now forgotten, all essential. Together they represented American power at its most fundamental level, not the power to destroy, but the power to sustain. Mitchell had understood this that day near the Elbe, watching Romanian prisoners mock coffee they didn't understand. He had carried that understanding through 6 decades of civilian life, rarely speaking of it but never forgetting. The knowledge that somewhere in the vast machinery of war, people had cared enough about him and men like him to figure out exactly what they needed. That knowledge was worth more than medals or recognition. It was the foundation of trust between soldiers and the nation they served. The last veteran who had drunk tank coffee died in 2019. With him went the living memory of what it had tasted like, how it had felt to prepare it inside a moving tank, the difference it had made during operations that pushed human endurance to its limits. But the principle survived. Modern military rations still reflect the same attention to detail, the same commitment to optimizing soldier performance through carefully engineered nutrition. The institutional knowledge persists, passed down through generations of quartermasters and food scientists and logistics officers. They work in obscurity, these modern descendants of Chen and Henley. Their innovations rarely make news. But soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq, and wherever Americans deploy, still benefit from their efforts. Improved rations, optimized hydration systems, engineered supplements designed for specific operational needs. The tradition continues, invisible but vital, a thread connecting World War II tank crews to contemporary warriors who face different enemies but similar physiological challenges. The story comes full circle. Romanian prisoners mocking American coffee, not knowing what American tankers actually drank. Captain Mitchell keeping silent, understanding that some advantages were better left unexplained. Torres and his restaurant, serving coffee that carried memories of war transformed into something civilians could enjoy. The metal tin surviving decades to become a museum piece, a tangible reminder of invisible care. Wars end, veterans age and die. Technologies evolve beyond recognition, but certain truths remain constant. Victory requires excellence in every detail. Soldiers deserve support that extends to their smallest needs. Nations that understand these principles and act on them consistently will prevail over opponents with equal weapons but less comprehensive care. Tank coffee proved these truths in ways that grand strategy never could. It was too specific, too mundane, too easily overlooked to become famous, but it mattered. It saved lives and shortened the war and demonstrated respect for soldiers through action rather than words. That was enough. It had always been enough. The men who had drunk it knew its value. The men who had created it knew their work mattered, nothing else was necessary. No headlines or monuments or public recognition, just the quiet satisfaction of having solved a problem that needed solving, having supported soldiers who needed support, having contributed to victory in ways only they would fully understand. Tank coffee represented American military power at its most essential and most human. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.